Hi everybody, welcome to Module 5, which is on non-parametric tests. These are a set of tests that don't rely on any assumption of normality. So, I know we've said that in this course you've kind of paid your dues in terms of evaluating normality, but even if you hadn't, you still wouldn't need to check normality on any of these tests. So the first non-parametric test we're going to do is called the chi-square test for independence. And a little bit about the name of the test. This is a lowercase Greek letter chi. It's actually a curly X, and it's lowercase, which is why it might look a little different than the ones you've seen associated with fraternities or sororities. So don't call it X squared, and also don't call it chi squared. This letter is sometimes written CHI, but that's chi, not chi. So this is the chi-square test for independence. So the chi-square test for independence is a non-parametric test, and it's one of the most commonly used hypothesis tests in all of statistics. This is the one where we look to see if there is a relationship between two categorical variables. So two variables that are either nominal or ordinal. The example we're going to look at is whether there's a relationship between the region of a country where a person lives, or where they lived when they were 16 years old, and their opinion on spanking as a form of discipline. Perception, at least anyway, is that people in the South are much more pro-spanking than people in other regions of the country. So before we actually start to look at the hypothesis test, let's look at some descriptive statistics that are going to help us look at the relationship between two categorical variables. So we're going to look at something called a cross-tabulation. And in our SPSS data set, the two variables we're looking at here, and these are alphabetized by variable name, so by name, not label. So we're looking at one variable which is called spanking. So whether people favor spanking to discipline a child. And the important options here, other than the missing ones, are strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So this is Likert. And then there's this one. Did a respondent live in the Southeast U.S. at age 16? And 0 is no, they didn't. And 1 is yes, they did. So let's look at a cross-tabulation. And to get to that, we're going to do Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, Crosstabs. And we're going to put one of these variables under rows and the other one under columns. And it doesn't matter which one's which. So we'll put, did the respondent live in the Southeast U.S. at age 16 under rows, and then we'll go find the spanking variable and put it under columns. And we'll click OK. So this first piece of output here, you've probably seen enough SPSS output by now that you recognize this as just telling you how many observations you have. So this just tells us that the sample size is 1,377, and then we have some missing cases as well. But that's all this tells. This table here gives us the, this table gives us our cross-tabulation. So a couple of examples on this table here, just to make sure you understand. So all of these are frequencies. So the 214 here means that there were 214 people in our data set that did not live in the South when they were 16 and strongly agreed that they favor spanking to discipline a child. There were 100 people who lived in the South and strongly agreed with that statement. Okay, and this is out of, there were 314 people total who said they strongly agreed. Of the people in our sample, 1,033 did not live in the South when they were 16, and 344 did. So that's just the raw data. That's our cross-tabulation with no percentages on it or anything. So if we go back over here, though, let's run our crosstabs again. Now, under cells, there are some options in here. I'll show you total percentages real quick, but it's not one that's probably going to be interesting. The total percentages show you that there were 15.5% of all the people in the study lived in the South and did not live in the South and strongly agreed with the statement. 33.8% did not live in the South and agreed with the statement. Okay, and for all of these, the hint that I always give in terms of trying to interpret the numbers is look for where the 100% is. Here the 100% is here, and that just tells you that these are percentages of the total. This tends not to be the most important one when you're trying to report data, report your results. So let's go back to crosstabs. This time I'm going to check the row percentages. And notice I turned off the total percentages because you don't want all of that on one table. SPSS will give you everything on one table, but it's really cluttered. So row percentages, and we click OK. And I've already copied those over here. So here, if you see, we've got 100% over here. So this tells us that out of 100% in this row, this is what the breakdown was. So of the people who did not live in the South when they were 16, 20.7% strongly agreed with the statement, 45.1% agreed, 25.8% disagreed, and 8.4% strongly disagreed. Whereas of the people who lived in the South, and again, that's because this 100% is here, this tells you that this is out of all this group. So out of all the people who lived in the South when they were 16, 29.1% strongly agreed with the statement, 50% agreed, 17.2% disagreed, and 3.8% strongly disagreed. Now let's look at the column percentages. So under cells again, I'm just going to turn off the row and turn on the column. And now you see that, they're bigger over here. You see that the 100% are down here. So this is telling you that of everybody who strongly agreed, this is what the breakdown was. So of all the people who strongly agreed, 68.2% did not live in the South, whereas 31.8% did live in the South. Okay, etc. So if you look at these, and maybe I'll write out a couple of these interpretations. So of all people who did not live in the South when they were 16, 20.7% strongly agreed, 45.1% agreed, etc. Whereas down here, of all people who strongly agreed, 68.2% did not live in the South, and 31.8% did. So I think it's really important to look at these and decide which one of these is going to be more useful, more informative to report. So you've got to decide what best answers your research question. And here, I mean, yes, we're looking to see if there's a relationship between these two variables, but we're also really wanting to compare people who live in the South versus people who don't live in the South. So we kind of have our two groups here we're wanting to compare. So to me, this tells us that these are the percentages we want to look at. We want to look at, of the people who did not live in the South, what were their breakdown of opinions, and then compare that to the people who lived in the South. And I think we can see pretty readily from looking at this that the people who lived in the South were stronger on favoring spanking to discipline children. So now let's run our hypothesis test. So our hypothesis test is, just like we've been doing. Analyze descriptive statistics, cross tabs. Move your two variables over, and again, it doesn't matter which one is in rows and which one is in columns. Under statistics, we're going to want to click chi-square, and then this here, which is phi and Kramer's V. Kramer's V is going to be our measure of effect size. All right, click OK. And then I suggest kind of deciding which one you want to see, row versus column percentages, and then selecting that one. And here we wanted to see row percentages. All right. But before we can look at this output, let's talk a little more about the test. So there is one assumption on the test, and that's that each expected cell has a value of at least 5. Okay, so I had you watch that video where they talked about observed versus expected, and you need to know that in each of the expected cells, that value is at least 5. If you don't have that, then you can kind of collapse some of the categories. Like for the one we had, we might lump strongly agree and agree together, and disagree and strongly disagree together. And sometimes that makes you have your assumption of your expected cells met. So the hypotheses on the chi-square test, we talked before about how it tests whether there's a relationship between two categorical variables? Well, our null hypothesis is that there is not a relationship between these two variables. The alternative hypothesis is that there is a relationship. Okay? Now, this word independent versus dependent, I almost hate to use it. It confuses people so much. When we say dependent, just in everyday language, we mean completely dependent. We mean something like, if it rains, then I'll take my umbrella. And if it doesn't rain, I'm not going to take my umbrella. But that's not what we mean here. Independent versus dependent just means tendencies. Okay, does this change the likelihood of things? Okay, so I think it's better to think about it as unrelated and related, even though you may see the words independent and dependent. And that's kind of what I was getting at here when I said this doesn't mean there's a cause and effect relationship, and it doesn't mean that one of the variables is completely dependent on the other. It just means they're related. So let's look at our output. And our output came from here. And I just copied it over. It's a little bit bigger and easier to see. So this is our test statistic. So this is our chi-square test statistic. And then this is our p-value. So this tells us that we are going to be able to conclude that there is a relationship between the region where somebody lived when they were 16 and their opinion on spanking. So let's talk about effect size. Before we do that, let me just write this down. So we can conclude that there is a relationship. So let's look now at effect size. So the measure of effect size we look at here is called Kramer's V. Kramer's V is calculated as the chi-square test statistic divided by the sample size times the degrees of freedom, and then you take the square root of that whole result. Degrees of freedom is calculated as the number of rows minus 1 or the number of columns minus 1, whichever one is smaller. So we have, in ours, we have 4 columns and 2 rows. So 2 minus 1 means that we would have 1 degree of freedom. Now, we don't actually have to do this calculation because SPSS gives it to us. And that's what this is right here. So 0.135, this is our effect size. And you don't have to worry about this approximate significance stuff. What we care about is this Kramer's V. And looking at the guidelines, and as always, these are really rough guidelines, and you really should pay more attention to the context of the study. Look at similar studies to see what the effect sizes were for them. But looking at the guidelines is a little more complicated than it sometimes is. The guidelines depend on what your degrees of freedom are. We said we've got 1 degree of freedom. That means these are our guidelines. So our Kramer's V of 0.135 is on the small side. If we look at post hoc tests, there are none. So yay, we don't have to worry about that. But here's what I said as a sample write-up. You know, we always have our first sentence to explain what we did. And we ran a chi-square test to look for a relationship. We evaluate our assumption. Each expected cell is greater than or equal to 5. Oh, and I forgot to mention that up here, if you look at just below this output here, this is where you evaluate that assumption. No expected cells less than or equal to 5. So assumption has been met. Okay? And I should say less than, not less than or equal to. Because the assumption is that it was greater than or equal to 5, so less than 5 would be the violation. So we talked about our assumptions, and then we found in our data that our test was statistically significant, which gave us sufficient evidence to conclude that a relationship exists. And then looking at the crosstab, so I looked at the row percentages, and I just lumped these two together, and I said, of the people who did not live in the South, 65.8% favored or strongly favored spanking as a form of discipline. And of the people who lived in the South when they were 16, 79.1% did. So that was what I reported as my descriptive statistics. If you wanted to report this as out of 100%, or out of the people who live in the South and state all those percentages, that's fine. It's, you know, it's a matter of what you think is the most informative for your research question. All right. So that's it for this lesson. And if you have any questions, please let me know.